So, good day again, students. By now, you have passed the first 4 lessons in this course. You have learned a bit about biomass properties, you have learned some things about biomass conversion technologies, you have learned what the end user wants from the energy supply system, and you have looked at the system as a whole from different aspects. From the lessons, you now have an essay describing biomasses in your own region. And you do have an essay in which you suggest possible routes to produce fuel from these raw materials. And then you have written a short manual on how to evaluate fuel quality in the context of end-user processes. And you have analyzed one supply chain in some detail. Now it's time to tie these things up into a nice final report. But before I leave you to your work, I want to give you a little bit of more background. It must be fully understood that the changing of an energy supply system in society is not a small thing. Of course, it all starts with a vision. That is obvious. Over the decades, I have seen several attempts to introduce bioenergy in different countries worldwide. Most have failed, and the reason has most often been that the visions were not realistic. To prove for yourself, and for those who will take the decisions based on your plan, you will have to find existing reference objects. In many cases that I have seen, have these references been research projects or pilot plants, but that is not enough. To convince politicians and financiers, you have to be able to point to real plants and systems. So find yourself an existing system to point at and analyze that system. You will never be able to copy, but you will be able to learn. Then you have to collect the necessary data. These data include the expected annual yields of biomass. The quality of the biomass must be evaluated, and so must the market and the customers. And this is exactly what you have done in lessons 1 through 3. Then make yourself a rough map of the system. At this stage, you will decide roughly where you will collect the biomass, and you will decide how big a storage you need, and you decide where to have the storage, and which units operations are necessary to deliver the desired product to the end user, and all those other things. When you do this overall mapping, you should also consider how many new jobs will be created. And you should consider what the fact that you buy the raw material and pay for it means to those who actually own it from the beginning. You did that in lesson 4, so you know how to do it. You will not be able to do a detailed socioeconomic analysis, but you will at the very least be able to make intelligent guesses. And you will refer back to your selected reference cases. So again must your references be plans with a capital T, not just plans. Remember that the ones to receive your plan are politicians and financiers. They are used to look into the details and to analyze the logics and the structure in complex plans. So you will not have a chance to fool them. But realistic estimates and intelligent and evidence-based guesses will be convincing. And then there must be a strategy. This is the most complicated thing, and is, besides the lack of realistic visions, the reason for most failures, at least according to my experience. So I will want to expand on this subject. I have seen many attempts in Chile, in Japan, in China and in other countries to set up a bioenergy supply system from scratch. So we have this classical situation with the hen and the egg. Which was first? And which one was the second? Did the hen lay the egg, or did the hen come from the egg? So let us have a look at 3 major examples from Sweden. Already during the 70s and the 80s were there attempts to try to establish wood pellets in Sweden. Burners and stoves were manufactured and imported, but there were no pellets. So a pellet factory was established. But no one trusted that there would be pellets available in the long run, so no one bought the pellet stoves and the pellet boilers. So the factory went bankrupt. But only a few years later something happened. A decision was then taken to introduce biofuel into a coal powder-fired 100 megawatt thermal boiler in Stockholm. Stockholm Energy, which was then a public utility, built a pellet factory and bought 2 boats to keep down the transport costs. But that was not the first thing that happened in Sweden. Already 7 years earlier had the energy utility company in Uppsala, north of Stockholm, decided to retrofit one of their boilers from coal. Just like with the wood powder to Stockholm, it is crucial to keep down the transport cost. So a briquette factory was financed by the utility company, and then the briquettes were ground in Uppsala and the pulverized fuel burners were quite happy. The briquettes were transported by train in that case. Now, peat is no longer a big fuel in Sweden, and that is because the European Federation, following many years of debate, decided not to consider peat a biofuel. But peat is still used to some extent. Anyway, that was not the first thing that happened in Sweden. 2 years before Uppsala did the utility company bieoenrgy decide to start phasing out oil and replace it with biofuel. The first project was to retrofit an oil-fired boiler to wood powder. The interesting thing in this case was that the utility contacted and contracted the Forest Owners Cooperative. So the Forest Owners Cooperative started a forest fuel production company. Looking back now, we see that these 3 success stories have one thing in common. All 3 start with a decision taken by a utility company to become a major customer of biofuel. The second step in all 3 cases was to establish the fuel production. In Växjö was the fuel production outsourced to the Forest Owners Cooperative. But in Uppsala and in Stockholm did the utility companies do it in their own regime. But the important thing is this. First of all, there has to be a major fuel consumer with a large demand. The plant owner has to be reliable, like for example a city or a utility company. Once this decision is in place, will it be time to sort out the fuel supply? Now the plant owner must offer contracts that are long-term and large-scale. Because the fuel manufacturer, they will start from this contract only. So the contract must be big enough and trustworthy enough to carry the full investment cost and the risks for the fuel factory. What then happens is that the fuel supply system is in place. Once that has happened, is there a major flow of fuel? And now starts the natural rationalization and cost savings that are inherent in all large-scale operations. So that system becomes smooth and reliable. Once this main flow is at hand, can side streams be diverted and small users can establish. The system is then established, and not only will the number of users grow, but also will new fuel manufacturers establish. So now we go back to the planning document that you are supposed to make. What you will have to do is to identify the key actor in your region. The key actor is the one who can decide to build a large-scale plant. The first system will be costly. That is natural, because you will have no experience from the beginning. So what you need to do is to identify a customer who is willing to take the extra cost. The benefit for that actor will be policy and politics, taking a green initiative, flying the green flag, being in the forefront of the sustainable society. In that quadrant, actors that are sensitive to political and policy issues, but who might be willing to accept a higher price, will be public utility companies. There might be other actors in your region, but my experience is that utility companies are the ones most willing to take the initial risk. Anyway, once these 5 things are at hand, you only have to set a realistic time schedule for the whole thing. Do not forget that in this you will also have to allow handling times for planning permissions and environmental consequences descriptions and whatever could be asked for. There will be a lot of paperwork that has to be done, and that takes time. So allow for that in the time plan. Now this was the extra background to your mini project. You may now be able to guess what you shall do to earn your femto certificate, but I have prepared a separate instruction video for you. So have a look at that video now and then go on with work.